Okay, in the last part of this week's work, I want to essentially do a segue explanation between this week's material and what we're going to do over the next couple of weeks, talking about youth and immaterial labour. I'm not going to go into much of the definitions of immaterial labour. That'll be quite important over the next few weeks, and we'll do that then. So what I'm doing here is relating the work I've been talking about in terms of this kind of blurriness between young people's careers and their creative practices, but also the way these things are co-opted. So firstly, a quick reminder there about the figures of youth stuff. So this is kind of the introductory material from that will help you understand what I'm talking about here. The way that different young people are figured in a variety of different contradictory symbolic ways, symbolic violent ways. Youth often uses scapegoats and punching bags and smoke screens for structural deficiencies and various problems. They're also kind of co-opted and kind of used to kind of sell us life. It's good to be young and everyone wants to be young and all that kind of thing. All that kind of stuff that's in that paper, just kind of keep that in mind in terms of what I'm talking about here. So one of the things I want to talk about here in terms of the relation to youth study stuff is this kind of notion of youth and young person. And I think it's important that we kind of create a little bit more clarity around those terms. So I think youth needs to be thought about more conceptually, that kind of stuff that I talk about in the figures of youth paper. And young person needs to be more considered about the actual living and breathing young person that we talk to in our research and observe in our research projects. The conceptual thing has kind of been used to understand that liminal period between child and adult. But importantly, as I kind of pointed out elsewhere, that it's become as much an affect here in terms of used to sell us stuff, used to promote things. And it's also very much kind of bound up in some of that governmentality expertise stuff that I was talking about earlier in the course. So what I'm trying to do here, though, is kind of point out how youth culture, I suppose, is very much part of these kind of co-optation processes by taking aspects of young people's lives and their creativity, particularly kind of more resistive and rebellious stuff, and it's kind of co-opted in various ways and then sold back to the mainstream at a kind of inflated price. So you can see this in ways, for instance, when, the stupid moral panics about young people and how they eat too much avocados and can't buy a house. That's an absurd kind of economic argument, which I've spoken about already. But what that moral panic also does is it's used to kind of create cliques. Those controversies, whether stories in the Sydney Morning Herald or whatever about that kind of stuff, create people to come and read about it, view things used to sell advertising. Their young people's exclusion from the housing market itself is used and packaged up in ways to kind of sell us stuff, create cliques, draw us to websites and all this kind of thing. So in that sense, there's a kind of immaterial labor going on there by young people that's largely out of their control. Their actual day-to-day lives are exploited and distorted and then sold to kind of create controversies and attract people to consume particular kinds of media. An example here I would use too is this kind of symbolic example I've got here. It's a nice Gen Xer example because Gen X is often left out of the generational conversations. You can see here the kind of the mohawk, the kind of traditional punk version of it. And what happens over 20 years, it's kind of placated down into kind of the more faux hawk that David Beckham made famous. Similar thing as, grunge happens and, Kurt Cobain wears $2 flannels to kind of make an artistic symbolic statement, away from hair metal and away from kind of expensive fashion. But then, very quickly as grunge becomes popular, they're sold for $150 in boutiques. So their youthful culture, therefore, is kind of moved away out and off young people's actual bodies and practices and used as more this kind of symbolic immaterial way to meet various capitalist ends. So importantly here, and this is kind of one of the more important points of what I'm trying to say in this section, is that youth culture isn't really just for young people anymore. It's pretty much just culture. And you can see a bunch of examples that I've got there. Something like graffiti that's been researched a lot as kind of particular resistive and symbolic creative practices is now used as kind of tourist attractions. Melbourne's got its famous graffiti lane, and increasingly local councils are using street art and stuff like that as tourist attractions. You can see something like the kind of huge culture industry in terms of film is largely based on comic books, that were 20, 30 years ago, largely youth practice and seen as kind of silly and like something you would grow out of. People are consuming this stuff well and well into later life. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, endless prequels and sequels, same as the Star Wars stuff. What maybe once be referred to in the 80s as computer games, and seen as very much nerdy culture, is now the biggest culture industry. I would make an argument that if the Queen is a gamer, it's no longer a youth culture thing. So that's a very real example there of her having apparently a gold-plated Nintendo. We can see this through other things like the hauntology and nostalgia in kind of much Netflix kind of stuff like Stranger Things. The way that people like Greta Thunberg, an active climate change activist, is kind of turned into memes and has her meanings distorted in all kinds of other ways. The way that kind of what was previously seen as a hipster aesthetic is now pretty dominant. Even things like McDonald's have many of the things that were once seen as hipster aesthetics. And the way that kind of youth itself is constantly used as a moral panic and a scapegoat and smokescreen. Many of these things, again, are being divorced from young people themselves, and youth becomes this more floating signifier. So I want to encourage a more reflexive understanding of this difference between youth and young person, the difference between, living, breathing young people and their conceptual, figurative doppelgangers, and how that kind of space between the young people's bodies and the concept of youth is an immaterial and figurative way that the capitalist kind of industries create value. And this is importantly, I suppose, even more developed with kind of online digital spaces and platforms and stuff like that. But what's left out of this is kind of the co-optation process, I think, in more kind of empirical detail. So just let me touch on that a little bit. Here's an example that I've already shown, and it's that example of Stan kind of talking about the kind of lines between selling out and not. He talks about here how they did a gig for a shoe company, and he felt like someone at head office in America is getting something out. It's certainly not the Vietnamese woman who's making the shoes. So here's a really good example of the co-optation of punk practice and how it's turned into immaterial labor. The coolness and edginess of Stan's band is kind of extracted and associated with multinational corporations to try and make them cool for potential buyers. So there's a kind of constant kind of playoff there for the likes of Stan about that kind of co-optation, selling out stuff, and the very much reflexive realization that they're kind of being used as a form of immaterial labor. Again, we'll go into that concept some more later on. But importantly, and here's where we're segueing into the future weeks of the course, is that much of this kind of more immaterial forms of co-optation is done also on a very, and relies upon a very kind of traditional exploitation of young people's bodies, very much in terms of exploitation that Marx talked about. So in future weeks, we're looking at the hospitality industry, and this is kind of, I suppose, the site of many, things like gigs and artistic kind of displays and all this kind of stuff. And Greg's been working in the hospo industry for ages. And what we'll kind of talk about is how young people's kind of very presence in these spaces is valuable. The way they look and the way they behave and the things they know are valuable for hospo places to be able to brand themselves in specific ways, and can often blur the lines between work and leisure. But as Greg points out, as he's getting older now, 30, there's a point where it becomes empty. He's outgrown it, but he still needs to do this work. It's part of the course. You just don't really want to do it anymore. But you can't really bring the party all the time and try and, increase the vibe for others. The good vibe was once kind of part of the thing that he enjoyed, but now it's increasingly kind of become exploitative and alienating. Jenny's another example. She's been doing work in the hospo industry for nearly a decade as well, doing it a long time. She doesn't want to work nights anymore. She's been kind of desynchronized from her friends because they work in days. She feels trapped. She doesn't feel like she has a way out. And for Jenny, who doesn't have many material economic options, she kind of feels trapped in this hospo industry. So here you can kind of see two different kinds of exploitation. The more immaterial version in terms of the punk scene and their coolness being exploited, and here the more kind of material embodied version of it that we'll talk about in aspects. And we'll talk about how both these kind of things come into contact in the hospitality industry over the next few weeks. So to sum up, the temporality of this stuff is important, you know, for the labor aspect there. For the young people working hospo to begin with, it's fun, and then it becomes less fun. The same thing for the people in the punk scenes, you know, the kind of activity of making music and being creative and having to and being able to express yourself comes into contact as you kind of move along and get a little bit bigger with these kind of broader co-optation implications. In terms of the kind of youth, young people stuff, it's in these kind of space, I think, this kind of ontological space between young people's bodies and their kind of more conceptual understanding of youth, that much of this kind of extraction of value happens. It blurs the lines between production and consumption, between work and leisure, and many other kind of dichotomies that we'll look at in more detail in future weeks. But also it kind of emphasizes how youth culture itself, particularly when related to nighttime economies, is really big business, and young people are very important to it, but they're kind of fundamentally exploited in it. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks.